Thanks, Tommy. And there are people that live beyond the Bombay Hills. It's nice to be representing them. So Tommy's already said a little bit about who I am. Yes, I'm an intersex person. I'm also queer identified, and I've been active in our community since my late teens. So there's a reasonable history there. I turned 60 in a couple of weeks. So yes, yeah, yay. I think Tommy's covered the why am I talking today. Who am I talking about? It wasn't hard to get excited about coming up today, but I'm standing here today with a lot of emotion and feeling. Yesterday, before coming up here, I'm going to be careful to protect this person, but a person that I'm supervising came to see me. This person is queer identified and works in our community in a mental health setting. Originally came to see me because their relationship had broken up, and we talked about the place that this person is working in and had determined that it wasn't really a safe place for a queer identified person, and indeed they have found themselves a new job. So I thought yesterday was going to be a transitional session, and I could tell the minute this person arrived that it wasn't going to be. And then what I spent most of yesterday was working with this young person, because the night before one of their clients had taken their own life, and I had this young person probably also at risk. So I thought I struggled whether I should even talk about this, but we are talking about suicide as if it's something out the door, and it's not. It's here in the room. And those of us that work in this area know we are losing way too many people because of this. So what I want to talk about today is why, and I'm excited that the focus of today is about wellness. And do we need to change? Fuck yes. The person that drew this amazing images in the room, I won't out them, but we do need to change. So yes, I come to today holding my own pain and frustration and anger, but as I often need to, and many of us who work in this area need to use that to motivate myself and my desire for change. And the question that I have for all of us is, how many more of our family have to die before we do something? Really do something. And I draw inspiration. Tommy was talking before about mentors. We all need mentors, and two of the people that continue to inspire me are no longer with us. Heather McAllister. Heather was an amazing LGBTTI activist in America who died of ovarian cancer. And Heather shouldn't have died of ovarian cancer, but she was an artist. And in America, artists usually don't have health insurance because it costs too much money. So by the time the community had rallied around, and they did, and they raised enough money for Heather's treatment, it was too late. And my friend Max, an intersex person, Max, like many of us, had a gender assigned at birth, and the doctors decided that Max was really a female person, and through hormones and surgery, Max grew up as a female. Didn't really feel like a girl, like some of us didn't really feel like a boy either, but decided to live as a guy. And in America, like here, the medical system is very binary. And Max developed cancer of the vagina, as Max's vagina was constructed out of unstable tissue, and that had happened when he was an intersex person. Unlike Heather, Max did have insurance, but his insurance was for a guy, and how do you get all the tests that you need when your bits inside aren't really guy bits? And again, like Heather, by the time the services were provided, it was too late. Now these words are Heather's words, and I think they're useful for us to think about today. And these were her words to planet Earth before she died. Please remember to love each other and to love ourselves, take care of our minds, our bodies, without fail and against all odds. Know beyond doubt that we are all beautiful, amazing beings. Never forget, that is what I lived for. Take care of yourselves, you beautiful beings. And I hold that. I hold Heather's words, and I invite you to think about it today. As Tommy mentioned before, and I want to acknowledge the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, because for the first time in 15 years I'm doing this work and being paid for it, thanks to the generosity of one private donor organisation in New Zealand. I do quite a lot of work in Australia with the Health Alliance, and people have already referred to the work of the Alliance today, but some of you won't know its history. It's relatively short history. And the person who did all the establishment work in the Health Alliance was Garby, New Zealand Garby Rosencreech, who was one of the members of the MSD Rainbow Desk. And the Rainbow Desk doesn't exist anymore in MSD. It didn't cease to exist in a sort of formal sense. It slid into gentle oblivion. And I often think, you know, why weren't we as a community out in the street rioting? Because the Rainbow Desk was only 2 people. And why didn't we object to it disappearing? And it disappeared like lots of things in this country, just slowly. And really, we got to know it wasn't there over a period of a year. But Garby went to Australia and the Health Alliance was established. Now, one of the things that people talk about is a peak body in New Zealand. You know, why don't we have a peak body? Well, you can't have a peak body if you don't have a body. And in New Zealand, the number of LGBTTI organisations that exist is tiny. They're shrinking. And most of them, I think, at the moment are at risk. We wouldn't have the capacity to collectively put money in to create, as they did in Australia, a peak body, an alliance. And in Australia, the government has come on board, and the organisation that Garby set up now has 8 people working for it. At the end of last year, I had the privilege of going to Sweden to attend the World ILGA Conference. The conference was hosted by RFSL. They're one of the longest, oldest established gay lesbian organisations in the world, and they have had government funding since the 1950s. And if I wanted to use an image to sort of hold as potential for us here, the youth hosted the conference one night, and we went to the RFSL headquarters, which is a very, I think it's 8-storey building close to the centre of Stockholm. And out the back of the building is a glass atrium, probably twice the size of this room. And the youth of Stockholm were in there. And the vibrancy and energy and vitality in that room was extraordinary. And if we want to use an example of how funding organisations, supporting organisations makes a difference, we have that as a model already in the world. So peak body, first you need a body, and then bodies are the sum of many and much more. So what do we need to change? We need to bring resourcing back into our community and into the communities that support our communities. Funding has to be an issue that's put on the table, and it needs to be both at a local level and at a national level. And what they're now saying in Australia, and I think we can start thinking about in this country, it has to be in an equivalency level of our population. There's been various figures tossed around this morning. I think if we think about our whole rainbow, it's got to be larger than 6%. So what's 6% of the spend? And is 6% going into our community at the moment? My hunch would be, I'm not an economist, I don't work in those sorts of things, but I would think it would be a fraction. And if we're going to put money in, it has to be across the sector, and we need to build, sustain, and develop capacity in all areas. No more abandoned centres. This is a bit dramatic, but in Wellington, we currently have no funded queer organisations other than, I would say, one. So our youth organisations at the moment who did have paid staff last year are all back to being volunteer organisations. So probably the AIDS Foundation is the only organisation in Wellington at the moment. And we could go around New Zealand and that would be replicated. I think the situation here in Auckland is slightly better, but I know Rainbow Youth, for example, is struggling for money once again, and you did have people, paid person in education, and I know that that's up for question at the moment. And the other thing that I would plead, and I'm in the same situation at the moment, it has to be sustainable, this idea of giving money to organisations, but only for a short period of time. So you build capacity, you get all those systems down, and then the funding stops and the organisation disappears. And all that knowledge and history is lost, and that's been repeated in this country over and over. On Monday, I was out doing some training in Porirua. One of the youth mental health organisations invited me, which was just wonderful. And I wasn't sure where to pitch the training, and this is not a criticism, it's an observation. I was shocked at the lack of knowledge with my professional colleagues. And so I stood back and I said to people, how many of you had this training covered, this area covered in your professional training? Most of the older colleagues in the room had had no professional training at all. And there was a small group of young social workers that had had gay and lesbian issues covered. Nobody had had training in transgender, and people in the room were struggling to even know what intersex was. So the place that we need to start is, I think, with some slight regional variations, very, very basic. So I'm saying this needs to happen across all professional groupings and all sectors. So if we're going to do this training, I think it has to be good training. We need to think about accreditations. In Australia, and I'll be talking about this project, they've got a very big project, and it's already been raised this morning, looking at changing policies in the aged care grouping. And so talking not only about accreditations, but making sure that organisations are accredited, and then sanctions. So if you're not following to this standard, what's going to happen? Are you going to lose your government contract? Will there be some sort of financial punishment? So I think it's quite complex, and it needs some thought. As I said, when I was talking about the training that I did on Monday, I was shocked to realise that most people in the room were completely unaware of the best practice guidelines that do exist. There are documents that have been developed. Most of them are not developed here in New Zealand, but they can be easily adapted for New Zealand. So one of the things that might come out of today and might come out of our workshops this afternoon is at least having a viable list where people can go to get core reference documents for working in this area. I would like to see this work led by our rainbow community. I think this is where the knowledge is, and there's a lot of expertise in this room here. So I think it's working out partnerships so that the community is leading the work, being paid for it, and then it needs to be connected to government policy. It's already been covered this morning about the importance of data. We know that we have data in some areas, but it's very clear that we have huge data holes. Someone raised the issue before about the census. I was in a meeting several years ago, and the person who leads the census was there, and we were talking about including sexual orientation, and there's been a group of people trying to do that for 25 years to get that data collected, and it was extraordinary. The meeting went on for nearly 2 hours, and finally the woman who, I don't think she does anymore, but manages the unit, stood up and said, "We can't do this because it will corrupt our data." Yeah, and the room burst out laughing just like you are now. Like we said, well, your data is already corrupt. But it's interesting that they would stay with collecting what they had in the past. And that is a big issue as we start changing data. How do we do that? How do we say, well, we used to only connect information in a very binary male-female way? If we were to change it, how do we correct that? And how do we link back to our historical data and as we move forward? Commitment at the highest level to change. I know that there are some significant people here today, and that's exciting, but how do we take this to the highest level? How do we convince our government? How do we convince all our managers that this is an area that we need to change in? And I say, if we get it right working, and I'll call it rainbow for now, if we get it right working with all of the rainbow community, New Zealand is going to be a much better place for everyone, not just our community. And I heard our first speaker today saying that the New Zealand that she sees now is not the same New Zealand that she left in the 1980s. And I think that's a good question for all of us. Like, what has happened to that New Zealand, and do we actually care, and are we going to do something about that? I think that New Zealand is much more than our politicians. It's got to be. So that means dealing with the hard stuff. We've talked this morning already about reforming the law around marriage. If this was any other issue, would the hate speech that's gone on in television and the print be allowed? It's been extraordinary what people have felt entitled and been able to get away with talking about around this issue. And I've watched the impact on young people who, have grown up in a society that is more tolerant, and yet this issue has exposed the thinness of that. So I'm just saying here, it's a cancer that kills us. And I think dealing with that is one we're asking what needs to change. Well, absolutely, that is an area that needs to change, in my opinion. We've talked today about resilience, and I think that's really important. And I think one of the things with young people particularly, and we've already had someone raise the issue with our elder population, is fear and isolation. So how do we make sure that people feel like that they belong to a community, and a community that they can be proud of? We've already talked today about people's reluctance to put information on forms. Why are people frightened to put down who they are? Well, they are frightened to put down who they are because it might, in a very practical sense, place them at risk. A commitment to human rights. not token, a society that believes everyone is equal, that lives and breathes this 24/7. Now, in Stockholm last year, Ban Ki-moon sent one of his representatives to give an amazing presentation at the opening ceremony. And this is only part of the presentation that was given, but I thought I'd put it in. This week we celebrate the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaimed in its first article, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It bears repeating, all human beings, not some, not most, but all. No one gets to decide who is entitled to human rights and who is not. If we're going to change, Tommy talked before about heart, caring for and valuing every part of the rainbow family, and it is a very diverse family. And I think in particular, being there for our youth. Our youth is our future, and if we're going to make fundamental change, it's not that change isn't needed everywhere, but I think it's a critical area. Yeah, and I'll say it, What the Fuck campaign is one of the wonderful and very visible evidences of what's going on here in Auckland. And if I'm going to make a plea, I can say that because I'm not an Aucklander. Please keep Rainbow Youth wheels turning. The work that organisation does is amazing, and I think as a template for what could happen in the rest of New Zealand, absolutely. And you've heard today that we do have some hard data to support the work that's been going on there. And yes, absolutely, our rainbow community is not just a white community. Our rainbow community is a very diverse one, and any movement change must incorporate all its many faces and its different ways of understanding. We've referred today around languaging, and our white Eurocentric way is one way of describing the world, but we need to remind ourselves it is only one way of describing the world and understanding it. We have a new organisation. It's based in Wellington at the moment. That's just because the people that set it up are there. So this started in America, the Queer Straight Alliance, and typically set up in schools, though the more I think about it, a Queer Straight Alliance could exist anywhere. But the movement has come out of America, and we do have a group of young people with knowledge and skills in this area, and at the moment they're not doing very much because the bank account's got no money in it. So if we're looking for target areas that we can think about supporting, then certainly linking with schools and getting Queer Straight Alliances set up in our schools as an active way of improving the wellness of our rainbow youth. Yeah, and I'm coming back to just reminding us, so we need to remember culture, but we need to remember all those other subsets within our community. So community members with disability. One of the things that was amazing in Sweden was the conference was bilingual, and we also had people signing. So when we're organising anything, are we making sure that whatever we're doing is available to everyone in the community? I don't know if you can easily get up here in a wheelchair, for example. One of the things in Sweden that they did really, really well but hadn't thought about was people with disability. And we were there in minus 12 degrees trying to walk through snow and ice. And it's really hard to do that if you are walking on walking sticks, for example. Right, and this is a bit of a challenge to all of us in here who are from the rainbow community, and that's caring. So that first thing about caring for ourselves, my work before I became a counsellor therapist as I am now, I worked for 18 years in civil defence, and my area of specialty was critical incident stress management. As a profession, as people, we're very good at looking after other people, perhaps not so good at looking after ourselves. So burnout is very, very high and very significant part of our community. So how do we learn to look after ourselves better and each other, and deal with the destructive and self-harming behaviour in our community? I talked about the situation before, that organisation in Wellington. I'm not going to say who it is, it's not relevant, but I provide supervision for lots of people and lots of organisations. And one of the things that bothers me in New Zealand at the moment is too many organisations have unsafe, unhealthy behaviour going on in the organisation, and these are organisations whose job is health. How can we be delivering appropriate programs to our clients when our own organisations are toxic and damaging and we're not looking after ourselves as professionals? So if we're going to move forward and change, then I think making sure our own organisations are safe, high functioning, and actually mirroring all those things that we're talking about with our clients. I'm saying that needs to be done in a professional, coordinated, cohesive way, so that we're dealing with all our own stuff. Within our own rainbow community, we know that it's fragmented, that there are lots of divisions, and that we're often not very good at working in partnership. So I think if we're going to move forward, it's learning how to do that, learning how to listen to each other, find out where those places that we can work together and have a broad vision that we're all working towards. And I can see that that's starting to happen in Australia, and I can see the energy that that's generating. And I'm not saying that what's going on in Australia is perfect, it's not, but it certainly does represent what can happen with a collective vision. If we're going to change things, and I keep coming back to youth, but one of the things that I'm very aware of from my work is what I'm calling this toxic epidemic of bullying that's going on in our schools. Schools should be safe places for everyone, for the pupils and the staff, and I think we just simply need to say it has to stop and then work together to work out the mechanism for that. Talking to young people in the few schools that I've worked with, mostly teachers don't feel like they have the skills or the knowledge how to deal with this. So one of the things that's coming back out of today is going to have to be both that commitment and then realistic training programs that work towards reducing this and monitoring so that we know that we're on the right track. I'm not going to be covering everything that needs to happen today. I'm aware that I have just picked out a number of issues, but yes, I'm very aware that we do need to care and love and value our rainbow elders. And as I say, the Health Alliance has identified this in Australia and has this significant program and piece of work, and they are proposing legislation in Australia at the moment that would require all providers of care to train the staff, and then there would be a process of evaluating that. I don't think the legislation's been passed yet, but it's certainly something for us to look at and learn from and perhaps utilise here in New Zealand. I'm saying that we need to deal with the violence that's outside in our community, but also deal with the violence that's inside our community. Not surprisingly, our community has higher rates of violence than it should. And again, like all minority communities, our own behaviour is often not healthy for all kinds of reasons that we would know. Kids should be safe. We should all be, every single one of us. So again, that relates to what I was talking about before, bullying and safety in the workplace. you shouldn't be at risk because you're a rainbow person in the workplace. You shouldn't be at risk at schools. I used to think in Wellington during the day that I would be safe. A couple of years ago, I was assaulted outside my office in the middle of the day, and it was a harsh reminder that not only has New Zealand changed, but we can't take those sorts of things for granted anymore. Can we do this? I would say, can we afford not to? You saw those stats earlier. How long are we going to be the highest rating suicide risk in the Western world? I'm also saying we are reaching critical mass, and what's going on here today is indicative of that. And I'm also saying that now is the time. Both the energy that's in this country and what's going on in other countries. I think one of the opportunities that does exist through modern communications is to harness that. We don't have to do everything here in New Zealand. We can draw on what's going on in other countries. So I'm saying to everybody here, no more wasted deaths, no more wasted empty lives. And that it's time, someone already related to this, to realising the sum of all our potential. And that's me, and now we'll open it up to the floor.
Any questions?
Thank you, Marnie. I was just wondering, I don't know very much about what's happening in Australia in terms of the Rainbow Elder community work. Could you say a bit more about what's happening there in terms of what they're doing well?
So there's been a number of projects that the Alliance has been funded, and the Elder project is one of them. I went to a workshop presentation in Tasmania at the end of last year, so that's my main knowledge, and I can certainly get that information forwarded to you and perhaps disseminated. It's quite a dense, complex project that includes both research, developing these new policies, and then working at a government level to change government policy.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, I'm going to call on the one particular thing which is probably one of the main reasons for being here, and that relates to hate. It's insidious in our society. And our youth have got to respect that laws are made by society for everyone. When they see that sections of that society are picked on and that the laws are not appropriate or are treated too lightly, then society is very much at risk. And the suggestion that society is at risk of cancer is so true. Hate crime is something that applies in overseas. It does not exist in New Zealand law.
No, it doesn't. So that's when I was talking before, if we're going to do something, then we have to do it at a fundamental level. And that thing about respect and caring, there's a lot of learning to do in our community.
You know, without such laws, those who are marginalised, particularly, are left without an appropriate response from society. And I spoke recently about this, and because of a personal attack on myself in the last 2 months, I've had a personal attack 5 times. And I was at the big gay out, and I spoke to David Cunliffe. He was the only one I managed to get to talk to. And I said to him, do you realise we don't have hate crime? And he said, no. So many MPs, these are people who are supposed to be standing up for our society, don't understand the purpose of a hate crime. A hate crime...
Hate crime legislation.
Hate crime legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Not only do we not have hate crime legislation, we also do not collect data. So we have absolutely no idea. I'm currently lobbying my MP, my local MP, and he said to me, well, we need the figures. We have to prove it. We need to prove a law. Well, how
So-
can you prove something?
My suggestion would be that we take this forward into the afternoon workshops, because I think
Yeah.
it could be one of the substantive things that comes out of this.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
So, thank you.